Lots of folks back east, they say, is leaving home every day, beating the hot old dusty way to the California line. Across the desert sands they roll.
Okay, now basically I'm giving you an overview of the 1930s art. Some of the artists in the 30s worked for the WPA and in the WPA, and others did not. I have put up this image to begin with. It's a photograph by Margaret Bourke-White, and it looks back to the 1920s when the world's highest standard of living was in place. There's no way like the American way. The American family with a boy and a girl and a mother and a father, and you can even see the little dog at the other end of the thing. But with the 30s, all that collapsed. And you see the bread line in front of this 1920s poster. Now, how she caught it that way, I have no idea, but it certainly gives you the 20s and then the 30s. Next image. I wanted to give you an idea of what was popular during the 1920s, so you can see how the art changed into the 30s. This particular artist, Norman Rockwell, was very popular in the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, and the 60s. But America in the 20s loved Norman Rockwell by the day. And next artist? This artist, Salvador Dali, by night. In other words, the 20s was very two-faced. The very wealthy and the very poor, and the very disenfranchised, the anarchists, the whole black side of the 20s. Salvador Dali was very influential in the 30s, and we'll look at several images that are influenced by him. This one is the new surrealist movement, and by that they mean to portray something that is above realism or not realistic, obviously the melting watch, in the most realistic way possible. And the contrast gives you the punch. Next one. Other popular artist in the 20s was Edward Hopper, and his style doesn't change much. If you think of the 1890s, you've got the hero, the man of action, and you switch to Edward Hopper and you have the person watching the action. And the Bootleggers is kind of an interesting early one, gives you a picture of Prohibition. More typical is the bottom one, where the buildings give you the whole feeling of the painting and the stripped down quality of his buildings. The buildings have more character, actually, than the people he portrays. Okay, so that's what was taking place in the 20s. It was also a decade of experiment. And I'm sure you know what a Calder-mobile looks like. So that there were experiments in abstract art. Adventure, different ideas were popular. And that will switch in the 30s, where new ideas are dangerous. And we go back to strict realism. Okay, at the turn of the decade, the Chrysler Bridge was completed. The automobile and radio were brought to rural America. Music and entertainment. People didn't go out to dinner until the 30s. There were very few restaurants. Comics and movies, and William Carlos Williams predicted in the 20s that if America ever stopped making money, her whole concept of reality would have to change. And indeed it did. Kind of interesting, too, 1929, the beginning of the Museum of Modern Art. 1930, the Whitney was incorporated. So it gives you a picture of what is going to be the past. Next. Okay, we go back to that bread line. The crash, October 24th, 1929. There was a jingle, very common. Once I built a tower to the sun, brick and rivet and lime. Once I built a tower, now it's done. Brother, can you spare a dime? And America's self-image will begin to change. This print is by Reginald Marsh, and it shows the deepening depression and the deepening hunger of the working man in America. Next. Now, Reginald Marsh went to Yale. His parents were artists, and he studied at the Art Students League. He studied in Paris, and he said, rich people aren't any fun. He liked to do the everyday people in New York City. And so you get the 10-cent movie, and look at the marvelous variety of people there. Shop girls, a very dapper black man, the person handing out tickets. There's a huge variety of different kinds of economic strata that he shows. Next one. And that will be from George Looks and the urban realists that began to be popular earlier than that. It's in the tradition of urban realism. Next. And this is Strokey's Bar in New York City. Reginald Marsh wanted to go back to volumes and structure in art. He felt Impressionism was powder puff art. It didn't have any meaning. And so you see the marvelous structure of the L above Strokey's Bar. And again, the whole variety of people. Notice the cripple on the right. And his idol, he wanted to go back to, was, next slide, Rubens. And you can see the swirly, curvy line. Can you go back one, Jenny? Of the figures themselves that are stabilized by the structure of the L. Where's color? Very limited, isn't it? So that you'll get, sometimes like the 10-cent movie, you'll get bright clothing on the shop girls, but this particular one is very muted in color. Next. Next. And there began the great age of mural painting. Anybody know who painted this one? Yeah, Diego Rivera. Mexican mural painter. And what's different about Rivera and the whole structure of mural painting is that he was openly painting in service of the revolution. It was a political art. But inspired by Giotto, Michelangelo, and you see those monumental figures. Oh, I'd love a little arrow. But anyway, notice the man in the green costume right in the front. It was an age in which men wanted to prove that they could beat machines and be better than machines and worked machines. It was only later that we found machines might want to eat us instead of the other way around. But these were heroes. These were John Henrys. These were monumental figures. This one is a mural in Detroit commemorating the automobile industry. And that set the tone. Diego worked in America and had a number of studios, New York and Stanford, further in the West. I don't know exactly where it was. And so other American artists studied with him. Next. Anybody know who did this one? Do you recognize the style? Sure. This is Thomas Hart Benton. Yeah. And it's an easy style to recognize. Now, Thomas Hart Benton is sort of significant in that his life marks the shift in American focus. He started studying in Paris. He was an abstract painter doing very colorful, synchronistic, abstract pieces. And when he came back to the United States in the 20s and 30s, he entirely flipped. And he wanted to make his art about America, glorification of the machine, the values, and promoted what we consider American values. So this one is Arts and Life in America. And those very muscular, simplified figures. None of the costumes have any buttons or decorations or that kind of thing. It's a very simplified shape. You can see the structure of, now this comes in 5 panels, and it moves from this art in the city, and I'll show you the next one, in the West, and then the Indians in America. It tries to picture American culture. Notice the wall behind the lady with the cocktail shaker? It's sort of cubist in structure. And as you look at the others, as you look at the whole spread, the colors also move around in a rhythm. And the art, the line has a tremendous, almost Rubenesque rhythm. It's talking about Chicago. It's talking about the city. One of the groups I think is most fun is the 3 men. You have the businessman in the black suit. You got the mob boss with a cigar, and the hit man who does what they tell him to do. So, and what's the figure to the right? Anybody know what that is? It's not a person, it's a machine there.
Your right, our left, yeah.
Oh, no, it's your left.
Oh, okay.
You're right.
Still?
All right.
It's over here.
Oh, okay. It's over there, not the thing on the left. All right.
Still?
Yes, it's a still. So this is American culture during Prohibition. It's the still. And there's quite a lot of electronic equipment there. The lights, the board, with the circles on it.
What's that thing down below?
The thing down below.
The one on our left.
The thing to the left of the guys.
I think it controls the lights of the performance. Anybody else can have an idea. Yeah. So this is the party scene. Next. This is another in this very large paintings, and it is the art of the West. And again, you see this kind of surrealistic division, that wall over there again, of space. Is it inside or outside? Hard to tell. Right. What I did want to point out is the figure playing the harmonica to the left over there. And that is the young Jackson Pollock, who was an assistant to Thomas Hart Benton And he said, Pollock said, that one of the most important things he learned from Thomas Hart Benton was hitting that realism wall and bouncing back into sheer abstraction as a rejection of his mentor's style of art. Pollock was, and actually Benton too, was a near concert harmonica player. Pollock took care of Benton's child out on, where's Menemsha Point? It's not, it's out Cape Cod, it's out. That's where it is, yeah. So what he's getting at is the arts of life, and he stresses the vitality of the rural folk, the city folk, and the culture. Benton had his picture on the cover of Time, and Time made a whole article, invented a movement in America called the Regionalists, and it actually was a made-up thing. Next one, you'll see how different. Oh, we're still on Benton. Cotton pickers. Actually, Benton put his assistants and everybody in a truck and traveled across the country. And the cotton pickers, it was one of the ones done at that time. Next. Strikes. A lot of the artists were very socially conscious. Next, we'll finally come to the next regionalist. Aha! Okay, so you can see how very different. Who is this artist? Grant Wood, American Gothic. Actually, I think it was the dentist's sister or somebody that served as a model. And what we're looking at is artists that are turning away from Europe for ideas. They're painting America. And American Gothic refers, of course, to the windows on the church in the background, but also to tradition and realism. Now, Grant Wood can be very satirical at some points, but this one is I don't think, is satirical. Next. Anybody recognize the people that are singing the old nostalgic song? The tall one is John Wayne. This was to advertise a movie called The Long Way Home. And Barry Fitzgerald is among, I think he's sitting. And yeah, Mitchell is there also. Anybody else recognize somebody else? I did have the whole spread.
Anybody know who the guy with the bent knee is?
Is it Jason Robards?
He looks familiar.
Yeah, it might be Jason. Yeah.
It looks like close.
Yeah.
Young Jason Robards.
Yeah.
Could be.
Yeah.
And they're singing this very nostalgic song. Next. Yeah, now this is John Stuart Curry. And that is John Brown. Curry is the artist, and this is John Brown. Certainly is a rabble-rouser and a very patriotic picture. Next. And that is Leaving Home. Now we're getting a little later in the 30s where the Depression deepens, and this young man is leaving home because the farm is going bust and there's no jobs and that kind of thing. Curry also worked at the agricultural university in Kansas. Next. So he did a lot of beautiful horses and bulls, and it's iconic Midwestern America. Okay, next. So we're kind of traveling around the country, this regionalism movement, which, as I say, was made up. Yeah?
That Burchfield?
It is Charles Burchfield. And yeah, it is beautiful, isn't it? This is an early one of Charles Burchfield. He was a wallpaper designer in order to make a living and did this very individualistic style where everything means something. This one is an earlier one, and we're moving away from realism. We're moving toward a much more personal art. It's Noontide in late May. It's an attempt to interpret a child's impression of noontide in late May, the heat of the sun streaming down and rose bushes making the air drowsy with their perfume. Now, I wanted to find the quote because it's very good of Burchfield. He makes nature the main subject matter. It's an animated, vital life force that contrasts to man's mortality. Next one. You'll find a lot of broken farm buildings and nature's power to rejuvenate. Now you can see the lilacs bursting into bloom against the old abandoned farmhouse. And this must have been a common scene during the Depression. He also includes symbols. Take a good look at the hydrangea blooming. Can you make out what the blooms are? Yeah, they're skulls. So you can't call Burchfield cheerful. He is consumed with that vital force of nature and its humans' ability to degrade and leave, and nature's ability to rejuvenate. Notice the kind of Gothic filials on the house. Next one. And Burchfield develops a whole abstract language for feelings. This is a little bit later one. It's like Vincent van Gogh. You always know it when you see it. It's easy to identify. Next. Aha. Georgia O'Keeffe. And Georgia O'Keeffe had absolutely no need at all for the Federal Art Project. Why is that? Yeah. She did. And who was that? Alfred Stieglitz, much her senior, and he had died by the time that she went out to New Mexico, and so she didn't have to make a living from her art. But she's another regionalist. We're going across the country with different styles as we move. Georgia O'Keeffe simplifies her shapes a whole lot, and the color systems. So they form an abstract reality sort of as a symbol from the real world that's much more detailed. Next. What do you make of that? Same artist?
Yes.
So what's the bones doing floating in the sky? The sheep's head with this lovely flower right next to it over the hills of New Mexico. Okay, we're getting the Dali-esque surrealism idea. It's above realism. And it's things that she collected on the desert that she likes. The bones are dying, the flower is blooming. The same contrast. And this one is called Summer Days. Lewis Mumford said, O'Keeffe uses themes and juxtapositions no less unexpected than the surrealists. She makes them in a fashion that makes them seem inevitable and natural, grave and beautiful. And we go from there to the next one. Who did this one? Where is it? Pardon? Ah, close. Now we're going to Maine, but a similar, yeah, it would be Hartley, Marsden Hartley. And he again started in Europe, came back to the United States, and wanted to paint things that were, in essence, Maine and only Maine. Simplified, much more active than Georgia O'Keeffe with all those calligraphic scribbles in the water, and very strong. And then on the lighter side in the early 30s, next one. Who did this one? Maxfield Parrish. Okay, we get the icing on the cake. You get a little tired of all that serious stuff, and Maxfield Parrish is the icing on the cake. Do you see any surrealism, illogical stuff in this one?
The lighting itself is surrealistic.
All right. That Maxfield Parrish blue is a little unreal.
The trees.
Ah, and what's unreal about the trees?
They're deciduous and then they haven't dropped their leaves.
They haven't dropped their leaves and they're piles of snow. So you're getting the essence of the postcard Vermont scene. Summer, winter, snug, cold, all those opposites in Maxfield Parrish.
Mount Scottney in the background.
Pardon?
Mount Scottney in the background.
You think so? Could be. He worked in Cornish, New Hampshire, and various other places. He made his money making calendars and postcards and big paintings. He always reminds me of icing on a cake. Now, let's look at the magazines in the 30s, because they're very telling. Here we've got, again, Norman Rockwell, this lovely little girl who just hasn't been, she's been a tomboy on the playground. She's filled with black eyes and bandages, and she's been sent to the principal's office. And she's not the least bit disturbed by that. As a matter of fact, look at the glee on her expression. And Norman Rockwell could catch that wonderful expression on faces, on American scenes, the quintessential American artist in terms of magazines. But the Depression was tough. Next one. Oh, wait a minute. We're sinking into the Depression. And that actually did not tighten up terribly much until the middle 30s. This one is a print, and it's so gloriously colored with a field that is, you know, it's going to produce lots of stuff. Next. I don't know. I picked it off the internet and loved its color, and I forgot to get the name of the artist. Next. Okay, so this is what happens. The Depression deepens. The lovely farms are covered in the soil, the sand that's blowing away, the barbed wire, the look of the light. As a matter of fact, we get clear nights. I saw the moon tonight. This is a night which is just obliterated with the dust storm coming over the plains. So the people who were out of a job, the people who had lost their farms, they were in desperate need of help. And so the federal WPA, the Workers'
Progress administration.
Progress administration is the overall thing, and the Federal Arts Project is one of several arts projects under the auspices of the WPA. And the Federal Art Project said, no American art can come to those who don't live an American life. Europe, forget it. It's been the downfall of our American values. Okay, who do not have an American psychology and who cannot find an American justification for their lives. So we're rejecting new ideas, the things that came from Europe, and we're going back to things that are secure. So we can hang on to realism. Abstraction sinks to the background, although there is some. Realism is much more comforting. And we have an isolationist mentality. So there were a number of different aspects to the Federal Arts Project, 1935 to 1943. They employed 3,500 artists in the easel division. They paid them $25 a week to provide a painting once a month that you had to bring in to get your $25. There was another part of that who were commissioned to decorate public buildings, decorate the post offices, decorate the new art centers. And by the way, the WPA was responsible for doing 100 art centers across the country. So culture began to be available even to the poor, whereas before, oh, you might be able to afford a Curry and Ives print, but that was it. I guess most of you, like I, took art in the public schools. That began in the WPA. They researched the Indians, the various crafts and things made across America by different cultures. And they produced the American Art Index, which was a huge volume of all the things that we were making. So people would know about it.
Debbie, do you know how the artists were chosen? Did they submit work or?
That's a good question. I know how some of them were. Jacob Lawrence, for instance, was sponsored by Augusta Savage, and I'll show you their work too. I think you just had to apply. Mm-hmm. Now, if you're willing to make big murals and paint post offices and things, it's a very interesting thing because you weren't just turning out art on spec. Yeah. And the ones you did for the easel division, there was no strictures. You could do abstract art, you could do unpleasant art, you could do pretty art, absolutely anything, and you still got your $35 a month. And this kept artists working, young artists who would have had to go out and sell pencils. And you get the benefits of that by the 1960s. And I'll point out some of the very important artists who got their start in the WPA. So the people who did murals, what have I got next? I've got the division of art that was photography. And Margaret Bork-White went with a group, Dorothea Lange, Weston, all the great photographers, went out in teams to photograph what was happening in America. And this is Dorothea Lange photographing Southern children and you can imagine the opportunities that these kids had. Next. And this is the iconic picture, Migrant Mother, by Dorothea Lange. And she's an interesting personality because she was born in Hoboken, New Jersey. She had polio at the age of 7 and spent months in an iron lung. And finally was able to get out of it. She was very dependent on her mother, obviously, and she was a cripple. Walked with a limp all the time. I was physically disabled, she says. I think it was the most important thing that ever happened to me because it gave her a unique insight into the suffering of America and outsiders. And certainly the migrants that ended up in California were outsiders. Grapes of Wrath is one of the iconic books on the subject. Nothing to Eat. This is one of the few pictures that Lange said that she staged. Usually she was making snapshots. But this group she saw, but she encouraged the mother and how the children were hanging on her and that kind of thing, one of the few. But these artists, if you're interested in them, Google them and tap on images, and you'll get wonderful images of these artists. Next. But not everybody took pictures of the Depression. Who took this one? Pardon? Ansel Adams. And he does the iconic black and whites of Yosemite. This one is one of the canyons, I'm not sure. Chaco Canyon or the wonderful contrast on this one. Pardon? Okay, next. Here are my magazines. I must have gotten these confused. We had the Norman Rockwell one, The Good Part of America. But when times get tough, you take any pleasure you can find. And the pulp fiction magazines, and also the terrible treatment of women in these magazines is very interesting. And you get some, actually, there were some of the magazines that didn't emphasize the dissection of women. And that. There's one with a test tube, a little woman inside it, and the mad scientist giggling over it. There were several magazines that did the same thing to men that were marketed to women. So it was an equal opportunity. They all emphasized violence, and they were an escape fiction, particularly for men. Next. Oh, there's the one, Spicy Adventure. I didn't know whether I'd kept that in there. There's ones for Hell's River. She's getting hoisted on something. He looks very attractive, doesn't he? Okay, next. Okay. Along with the recording of American culture, you get the tremendous building programs. Now, this is the Norris Dam in Tennessee, a painting by Paul Sample on the Clinch River. It was completed in 1936, and it was part of the TVA rural electrification project, part of the WPA. Congressman Norris pushed the bill through, sort of a pork barrel bill, but it gave the Tennessee the stimulus for jobs. Take a good look at it. What else is going on here that's particularly of interest? When you build a huge dam like this, you've got to have a village to, this is way out in the middle of nowhere. You have to have a village to house the workers. And this was one of the earliest planned villages with a shop, schools, churches, houses, and they could plan the whole thing at once. You see Mike Mulligan and his steam shovel, a huge dam project. And that is being recorded by Paul Sample. Next. I wanted to put this one in here. I don't want to get much over. This is Henry Snackenberg. And he was born in Brighton, New York. And this one is a town in New Jersey. And it isn't recording the quintessential beautiful Vermont scene. It's recording the pollution industry in the cities. And I pulled some of these out because you'll see the same artist here. So look for them. The technique and colors are very similar. Next. And this is the building of, I think this dam is on the Columbia River. William Groper. And it, like the Diego Rivera Detroit one, it's certainly glorifying the workman. Now, Groper was near communist, and of course we're building up toward the McCarthy era. And the symbol for communism, the little figure at the top there has a red handkerchief in his pocket. So lots of these take in the symbols of radical social projects. Next. There it is. Can you see the red handkerchief up there? There's a detail. Next.
The guy at the top?
Yeah.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah.
Next. Okay, now this is a Joseph Stella. And it's an abstract one of the city of New York. You can see the buildings on either side, the lighting effects, and we have a Joseph Stella over there, so look for something similar. He gives the wonderful flickering light of, I'll show you another one, of the city. Do you see any landmarks that you can recognize? The Brooklyn Bridge. And for Joseph Stella, the Brooklyn Bridge, a lot of these landmarks were almost religious. And this little bit later one than the one we have has wonderful colors in it. And of course it derives from Cubism and the breaking up of space and the reassembling it in the artist's creation rather than God's creation, or the way nature made it. Next. This person is James Brooks. He did abstract art, a New York artist. Can I show you the abstract one next? Total abstract. During the 20s, early 30s, but as Depression deepened and he needed money, he worked for the artist project, those initials. Anyway, he worked for the WPA artist ones. Next. And he did this mural labeled Flight. Does anyone know where it is? It is in LaGuardia Airport. And again, it has many more pieces of flight. You can see the figures who are looking up in the air, the instruments they use to fly, the biplane over to the left there. And it was a composite, a sort of cubist idea of flight. Now, when people got tired of it and the WPA fell flat by the 40s, they painted it over. And then in the 1980s, they've restored it. Has anybody been to LaGuardia recently? Well, it should be there because they took the white paint off it and restored it.
Wow.
And that's happened to some of the post office paintings and other paintings. I hope you get a more detailed description when the person talks about, yeah. Next. Okay, now this is fun. This is an easel painting, Ron Slayton. You see some of his prints right over there on the wall. And you'll see this, it's in the other room.
Next to Joseph Stella.
Okay, this is a easel painting. He had to present it and get paid, but it's weird.
It's called The Idea.
Yep. What do you make out of that? Why is it called The Idea? Could be. So he's holding up the hand with a paper.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what's happening here, but the idea evidently takes place in the brain, the face. What do you make out of the double mouth? Maybe sometimes it is about to smile, sometimes it's closed shut. Surrealism. And there is a very famous artist that took that idea of the double mouth. Next. Whoops, that's the idea of assembling facial features to suit the artist, Picasso. He will have seen something like this. And the next one? William de Kooning in the 50s. He dealt with the mama at the docks, very low-life, fat mama. Look over there up at her face, she's got a smile, and then down as a necklace she's got teeth. It's a double smile again. So that must have been interesting to the artist. This is much later. Next. Okay. Here is Rivka Angel. What? She's got a last name. Is it?
Yeah, she's hanging up in the other
Yeah, she's hanging up in the other room. So go find her. It will be just similar. It's not exactly.
You'll recognize that girl's face.
You will.
Yeah.
And she walked around Brooklyn. She wasn't professionally trained. She painted what she saw. And she saw children dressed up, sort of folk art kind of painting. And folk painting and art became very popular. It was looking at the past, the real America. Abby Aldrich Rockefeller started a whole museum in the 30s in Williamsburg of folk art. So that it is one of the many ways to look at the American past in the 30s. Very colorful, not space in the background. It's got pattern in the background. So see if you can find her. Next. Okay, this is Alice Neal. She painted for the WPA. They didn't like it much, the people who she brought her paintings to. I don't paint like a woman who's supposed to paint. Thank God, art doesn't bother about things like that. And her daughter was a Vermont artist. Next. She had a terribly difficult life. She married someone from the Caribbean who went and took her daughter back to the Caribbean, and then he died and she married somebody else. She had a terribly awful personal life. So her portraits are not traditional. They are, look at those eyes. They're very psychotic. Simple. Next. But she became an icon in the, I think this is almost the 60s, of women's lib. And so it's interesting. She said that when she brought a painting, Alice Neal brought a painting in to get for her monthly painting, she was doing a butcher in New York, working on a piece of meat, and there was blood all over the place. And the person who accepted it said she had to take the blood out. So she painted over the blood, but when she bought the painting back after the WPA stopped, she put the blood back in. All right, this is a wonderful person, Augusta Savage, a black artist who did some lovely sculptures, did one for the World's Fair. But she decided she wasn't as good as what she could do to train the young. So Jacob Lawrence, Romer Bearden, the black painters, learned at the Harlem Center for Teaching Children. And she became very important to the young painters. Next. And in the Harlem Renaissance, in Harlem, there were painters also. And this one is the janitor who paints. It was Palmer Hayden doing almost folk art-like paintings in Harlem, New York. Next. This is Jacob Lawrence. And we have one, right?
We don't have one. We used to have one.
Oh, what'd they do with it?
Jacob Lawrence helped to buy the building.
Oh.
We lost Jacob, but we got a home.
Okay. He's a very significant black artist. And he worked for the WPA in the late 30s and 40s. He started now these are small, these are prints of the migration of the Negro to Chicago and the Western New York and the North. And they're powerful, small pictures. This is Escaping the South. What were the consequences of failure? Well, you're looking at it. And the simplicity and power of these paintings of prints of Jacob Lawrence. Next. And by the 1960s, this is Jacob Lawrence's mature work, Dreams 2 at the New Britain Museum, which I taught at. What are the dreams of the black people? This is a combination of some of the symbols that come from the Caribbean to Harlem, the bright colors of black art, and boy, the dreams don't look too pleasant, do they? Very powerful again. The colors are very acid to increase that sense of discomfort. Next. Now, there was a whole influx of European artists who came into America and were very influential at a later time, but were really off the walls in the 30s. Anybody know who this one is? Yeah, it's Ashail Gorky, who was an immigrant from Russia, taught in various places in the United States. And it was a growing group of exiles from Europe and from Hitler's Germany. This one is not restful at all. Agony, the power of color, line, and shape. Next. But they weren't all as violent as Gorky. This one is Bolotovsky, working on the ideas of Mondrian, who felt that, and Bolotovsky also felt this way, that his life had enough terror and angst in it. What he wanted was rest and pleasant abstractions to live by.
Excuse me, I'm a little confused. How do they relate? Are they part of the WPA?
Yes, they all worked for the WPA.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, that's fine. Any questions you have? These all worked for the WPA.
Thank you.
Because they were poor. We got Bolotovsky. And my favorite is Slobodkina, very much more feminine abstract. She worked for the WPA, and she came from Siberia. She was interesting because she said, to me, abstract art is not an abstract of nature, but to me, abstract art is an abstract of all the basic qualities of good painting transferred onto a canvas without the crutch of realistic, symbolic, or surrealist and socially significant elements. And when you think of realism as a crutch, then these become more appealing, perhaps. Simply the beauty of color, shape, balance, that kind of thing. Next. And Lee Krasner, the wife and partner of Jackson Pollock. And she painted in the 30s. These abstract artists really appreciated the togetherness of the art the community of artists who felt they were doing art that nobody liked and that it was supportive. She's working on Cubism here. And next one, Stuart Davis, who also worked for the WPA and did some murals for it. He's dealing with music and the intervals and rhythms that are shown that can be shown on canvas with shapes, and it has a wonderful beat to it if you look at the push-pull of the shapes and the colors. Now we move into the social conscience of the 30s, which also were paintings for the WPA, but they were a little more difficult because they were talking against the social situation of the 30s. Here you have the employment center, the Sawyer brothers, and I can't remember which one it is, with the sense of despair because there are no jobs. Next. This is Jack Levine, and he painted, he got his start in the Federal Art Project. he satirizes politics, policemen, cities. These are the syndicate. They're moguls of industry. Are you going to trust them? No, it's basically satire. Benton painted a significant picture of the Sacco and Vanzetti case. And Sacco and Vanzetti were Italians, liberals. Everybody in the 20s was afraid of anarchists. And they were convicted as political radicals and not convicted as killers. And so it was a trumped-up trial. This is the president of Harvard, the judge, the various people who wouldn't give the Italians a fair trial. It came up again as a retrial, and they said everything was proper. Wow. Next. And there are the two figures.
Were they executed?
Yes. Yep.
Wow. They
And
were the ones that murdered a kid?
Pardon? No, I know the one you mean. That's right. Yeah. Okay, what ended? Pardon? What ended?
You completely trumped up.
Yes.
There were 50 Italians who said that they were at this dinner, and one of them actually spoke at the dinner, and the judge dismissed the evidence because Italians always lie. And
Yeah.
what are you going to do? Yeah?
Okay, what ended the WPA? Why did it end?
War.
Ah, yes. And war was the biggest and best stimulus for the economy. And so we were gearing up for the war. The Republicans said that the whole WPA was a big boondoggle. And at the end of the 30s, there were constant cutbacks. The easel paintings that were piling up in the FAP local places, actually Vermont took the WPA paintings done in Vermont and kept them in the basement of the
Fleming, right?
Yeah, the basement of the Fleming. But the ones in New York, thousands of pieces of art were destroyed or they were sold off cheap to plumbing industry, 3 cents a pound, and used for commercial purposes. Sculpture, of which there was a lot, was put in a ship and taken out and dumped in the harbor. Murals were painted over, like the LaGuardia ones, and America began to pay attention to the growing violence in Europe. And we began to move away from isolationism toward world concern, mostly for Western Europe. This painting is Orozco. I think it's at Dartmouth. You can correct me if I'm wrong. And it is an indictment of civilization. Look at the Buddha in the background, the Ionic pillar, all the guns, and Christ, rather than being a religious figure, has chalked down his own cross. Next. This is Siqueiros, another indictment of violence and war. The child screams and screams again, and within that is another scream going on forever. Next. And the American painter Peter Bloom does this one, and he titles it The Eternal City. And also it's the destruction of the religious church over on the left, the Greek statues, the city in the background, and there's Mussolini popping out in green from a jack-in-the-box. So these are a great indictment of war and civilization. And the final one is Picasso's Guernica. So the isolation of the 30s in America, we've turned toward World War II. I'm done.
Questions for Debbie? Any discussion?
Yeah.
Hi, Debbie. Where are the Thomas Hart Benton pieces that you showed?
In the Britten Museum of American Art, where I was a docent for many years. Yeah. And that's a gem if you're ever down in that area. Yeah.
World War II didn't entirely kill the WPA. Yes, it killed the WPA as we know it, but funds from that were directed to artists to work on the war effort.
Okay.
My father was one of the artists who was sent out with the federal funds to go to VA hospitals around the country and draw 8 portraits a day to provide entertainment for the wounded soldiers.
I didn't know that.
And a lot of illustrators from the Saturday Evening Post, guys that were too old to go out and fight, as well as young bucks like my dad who were, 4F, who had art training, were paid to go out and do this work with the theater wing, so that there would be comedians and other people providing entertainment, but there were visual artists who were also going out on the road.
Part of that. All right, I'd love to answer questions. Why don't we break up? I'm sorry I went a little over an hour, but give you a chance to get up and walk around the exhibit. I'm happy to answer questions. You can.
Thank you again, Debbie.